Yes, Ms Graham.
Thank you. I was just about to move on to paragraph 7 of your inquiry statement, Mr Graves.
Yep.
And we'll just get that on the screen. And there's 2 sentences in it that I'm particularly interested in. The first one says, within the Met, when I worked there, we didn't have area control rooms, we had individual control rooms within each borough. And I wonder if you could help me understand. I know that Scotland Yard is the headquarters of the Met, and you're in London. Is the Met the only police force in London?
Yes, apart from the City of London, of course.
Right, City of London and the Met.
In the Met, and then you've got British Transport Police as well.
Right. And just to be clear, when you say the Met, they didn't have area control rooms, they had individual control rooms, is that's where you worked when you were working there?
Yes, they then moved over to area control rooms later on when I was still serving, but I didn't actually work in one of those.
Right.
Initially, each what would have been a borough or each station had their own control room, which just looked after their particular patch.
Right. So originally there were individual control rooms allocated within a borough,
Yes.
but then ultimately they moved to a system where there was one area control room?
It'd be an area control room covering anywhere between 3 or 4 boroughs, depending on the size.
Right.
Give you an idea, one borough I worked on was 26 square miles. It was just one station.
And within that area control room, there may have been up to 3 boroughs. And were there different people dealing with each borough within that area control
yes,
room?
the call could come into any of the call handlers or any of the dispatchers. So they're quite a lot larger sort of area control room. But I think we had, at any one point, I think there was about 6 around London that were controlling the different areas.
Right. And what size would the individual control rooms cover?
What would be possibly 2 to 3 stations, as I said. One I did work at a borough level before they went over to area control room, covered 5 stations and in excess of nearly 45 square miles.
Right. Thank you. Before your retirement from the service, can you tell us if you had any qualifications or experience of first aid training?
Yes, I've been first aid trained since before I joined the police. I did first aid training when I was a member of the Territorial Army. I continued that training and then became a first aid instructor within the police in, I think, about 96 or 97.
Right. And did you, as part of your role in London, did you also train officers in first aid?
That's correct, yes.
Did that continue up until your retiral?
It did within the police service. I now deliver first aid externally. I've got qualifications externally to deliver it.
Thank you. Can I ask you about the final, let me check, the final sentence in paragraph 7, and you confirm you haven't done the inspector role within the control room set up in Scotland, being the person making the decisions, but I have made those decisions in a smaller control room for a larger area of London as the supervisor controller of that control room.
Yes,
No?
controllers within the Metropolitan Police would be of sergeant level or senior PC.
Right. So you've done that at the sergeant level?
Yes.
During the time that you were a serving
Yes,
officer?
I have. Yes.
But not the inspector role or the ITFC role?
No, that at the areas now or at Scotland Yard, that inspector would be the sort of the same level. Yes.
Yeah. And we've heard that in Scotland the inspector role is permitted to authorise the deployment of an ARV.
Yes, that's correct.
Or declare a firearms incident. But officers below that rank do not have that authority.
Yes, as I said, there are differences across different services in relation to the deployment requirements. So yes, I believe it is an inspector level within Scotland.
And I understand in London the situation's different in relation to ARVs, is that correct?
Armed response vehicles are actually out and about patrolling. They're already out, equipped, and they don't need to be actually authorised to deploy. They'll be assigned to calls, but they don't need an authorisation from a senior officer.
So they are patrolling areas kitted up and ready to be sent to a call at any time?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. So as part of your role when you worked in London, would you be able to assign an ARV to attend a call or deploy them to attend a call without requiring any special authorisation?
I would, yes. I would be able to assign direct, and I would also be able to accept or reject them of trying to attend a call that I didn't think was suitable.
Did they sometimes volunteer to go to things?
On occasions, yes.
So you had authority to deploy them as you saw fit?
Yes, as required, based on the risk assessment of the call that was being received.
And that would be your risk assessment?
Yes.
And is that done in accordance with what they call in Scotland the national decision-making model?
It would be, yes.
And is that model used nationally?
It is, yes.
And so could you explain to us an example, say, of the circumstances in which you felt that an armed response vehicle was appropriate?
Certainly where there's a risk to the public, where the information or the intelligence that's being received indicates that a subject involved may be armed with a weapon. That could be anything from a sharp implement, a knife, to an actual firearm. Where an actual firearm was being seen, or where officers and members of the public may be placed in danger if that type of specialist support was not provided.
We've heard that in Scotland there's a particular firearm protocol which does not mean that there has to be a gun or a firearm, but it could also be a bladed weapon or a knife, something that could cause death or injury.
Yes, that's
correct. Is
correct.
that the
yes.
same?
It's the
in
same
London?
in the Met, yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at paragraph 8, please? And you say that decisions to deploy armed response units, is this what we've just been talking about, the slightly different setup in London compared to Scotland?
Yes, that's sort of overarching authorisations not required within the MPS because of them being out already deployed with firearms.
That's lovely, thank you. I'd like to move on to focus for a moment on your experience as an expert or a skilled witness in courts and inquiries such as this. Could we look at paragraph 5 of your inquiry statement? And you've said that you've provided in excess of 200 statements and actual expert testimony in excess of 100 cases in your role as an expert.
That's correct, yes.
And that remains correct today.
Yes.
And you've commented on a number of organisations who've been involved in cases or litigation where you've acted. MPS?
Yes, Met Police, yeah.
The Met Police. IOPC?
Independent Office for Police Conduct, formerly the IPCC.
And that's in relation to misconduct allegations?
Yes,
by
everything
officers.
from, as I say, deaths in police contact down to excessive force.
Right. CPS?
Crown Prosecution Service in England,
The equivalent of Crown Office here.
equivalent, yes.
And the Police Federation of England and Wales?
Yes, sometimes the Federation will instruct or fund officers, solicitors and barristers, and I'll be called or instructed by the Federation to give opinion on the case.
And that's the equivalent of the Scottish Police Federation
Yes,
here.
that's it.
Together with a number of other forces, including South Wales, Scottish Forces, Dorset, Bedfordshire, Merseyside,
Yes.
GMP,
Greater Manchester Police,
and Cambridgeshire.
yeah, well, among others, yes.
Could you help the Chair understand to what extent you act for police officers, either in defence or in relation to inquiries or that type of thing?
Irrespective of my instruction, my overarching responsibility is to provide impartial opinion on the information that's given to me. As I said, if it was from the Police Federation, it would be instructed on behalf of probably an officer who is being prosecuted or is facing misconduct hearing. In relation to the IOPC, it's where they're investigating possibly a death in contact or an allegation of misconduct by an officer. And again, professional standards, departments of professional standards within the police services across England and Wales, a number of times they will look for independent expert opinion in relation to cases that they're investigating around excessive use of force or misconduct, or again, deaths in police contact.
So you've mentioned that you understand you have obligations as an expert. And
Yes.
Sorry. Sorry, it was an accident. Sorry. So you understand the need to be objective and impartial, and as I understand it, in England, they have a book, the White Book, which says there's a part 35 which sets out and helps experts understand the importance of impartiality.
That's correct, yes.
Regardless of who is instructing them.
Yes, I mean, to give an example, I've regularly been instructed by one party and then actually been called by the other party in relation to the information or the evidence opinion that I've provided. So,
thank you. So when you've said here you have acted and given testimony, and one of the bodies was the Crown Prosecution Service.
yes.
So were you called as a witness in relation to a prosecution of a police officer?
Yes, I've been called to a number of cases, manslaughter cases, cases where the CPS have decided to prosecute officers in relation to excessive force or malfeasance in a public office.
Right. And so you've been called by the Crown, or
Yes.
what we would call the Crown,
Yes.
Crown Prosecution Service. And in relation to any of the others you've mentioned, say Police Federation of England and Wales, are you there acting on behalf of an individual officer or more?
It may be an individual officer or a group of officers that are facing discipline or criminal findings. Yes.
And your role will be as an expert witness in relation to those allegations of misconduct or discipline?
That's correct. Yes.
And are you able to help us understand maybe the percentage of times that you act on behalf of a officer or the Federation or a police force, and times where you've acted and been called as a witness by the Crown?
I would say probably more. I've given more testimony on behalf of the Crown or what you might class as the prosecuting unit, whether that be the professional standards or the actual service involved. Probably about 70-30.
70-30, thank you. You've said that you've acted for various Scottish forces. Are you able to give us an indication of any of those?
Before the formation of Police Scotland, obviously I'm excluding this case, I have previously given advice to in Glasgow and also to a case that took place in Aberdeen.
Thank you. And we touched on this earlier. You've looked at the evidence of a number of witnesses in advance of coming here today.
I have, yes.
And can I just check with you, that was PC Walker,
Yes.
retired PC Payton,
Yes.
PC Short,
Yes.
PC Tomlinson,
Yes.
and Inspector Stewart.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, we had Inspector Stewart back yesterday. I don't know, have you watched one session or
I
two?
only saw his first session.
First session. Oh, thank you. And apart from that, have you watched the evidence of anyone else?
I've dipped into some of the evidence, yes, of different individuals.
Thank you. Do you remember who they were?
I remember looking at some of the doctor's evidence in relation to the injuries sustained to the officers, and I think that was about it. I think that was the only one. I did get 39 hours of original footage to go through, so I had quite a lot to look at anyway.
Yeah. We've had a lot of evidence so far. And can I ask you to look at the use of force standard operating procedure, PS 10939? Oh, sorry, or PS 10933, sorry, I might have the number wrong with that.
Don't think that's in this bundle, is it, over here?
I just wanted to check with you, if you'll see this on the screen, use of force, and I understand that was recently sent to you.
Yes, I was originally given an earlier version of it, and this I received this on day before yesterday.
So this was a slightly different version sent to you in advance of today.
Yes, it's an update. It appears to be an updated version.
And have you had a chance to look at that?
I've had a quick look over it, specifically looking for any major changes. I'll be happy to be stand corrected, but I couldn't see any major changes other than what I would expect with regards to changes that have taken place in relation to use of force.
I agree, but I didn't want to influence you in any way. That's good. And had you had sight of this or a use of force SOP from the Crown when you were first instructed?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't given any training materials.
No training materials.
No.
And this is a standard operating procedure?
Yes.
Rather than a manual?
Yeah.
Or did you have that?
No.
No. And then can we have a look briefly at the OST course manual from 2013, which is PS 11538A. Now this is a large document. We'll see the first page is split into modules for officers. We've heard this is a training manual which came into force, if you like, in 2013 and was in force by 2015.
Yes.
At that stage. And you'll see that it's got a number of sections regarding a wide variety of topics. Have you had a chance to see that manual?
I have, yes.
And did you have sight of that when you did your report for the Crown?
I hadn't, no. But I was aware of the training at the time within Police Scotland.
And were you aware of the training manual at the time?
I was. I've seen a very similar version to this in one of my visits.
When you were sent your instruction by the Crown, were you sent a manual to look at or to consider?
No.
No. Could we look at a PowerPoint, please? OST PowerPoint PS 17208, I think that is. Now we've looked at this before. It's a number of slides on a PowerPoint. Have you had sight of that?
I have, yes.
Before today. When you were instructed by the Crown, did they give you access to anything like this?
No, not until I was instructed by the inquiry.
Right. This was part of a training. It's part of a document used for training, as we understand.
Yes, it would be the standard PowerPoint that would support the training. Obviously, it's open to interpretation as to who delivers it in relation to how much information is given on each slide. So.
That's good. We've heard that the manual's a bulky document, but some key points from the manual would be part of the slides, because there's only 30
what they consider to be the main
so.
bullet points, yes.
Yeah. Can I ask you now to look at a report by Joanne Caffrey, SBPI 00181. And you'll see the first page of this, it says expert witness report. If we go down slightly, you can see it relates to the incident on the 3rd of May 2015 and the reports from October 22. And again, were you provided a copy of this by the inquiry in advance of today?
I was last week. It's a substantial document. So yes, I've read the relevant sections that I think may come up in questioning, but I haven't done the whole document.
That's fine. I'll be asking you different questions anyway. Can I move on to your instruction with the Crown in 2018? I don't want to look at the report in any detail, but can I just confirm with you that we can take that off the screen? Thank you. Were you asked by the Crown to consider the overall management of the incident on the 3rd of May 2015?
Not initially. I was then called to Scotland for a one-to-one interview by one of the investigating staff. And during that deposition, I was asked questions in relation to the post-incident management, because I had actually commented on it anyway within my original report.
So you were asked about the post-incident management, so things happening afterwards.
Yes.
But in relation to the way the incident was managed from the time when calls started coming in, were you asked any questions about
From
that?
recollection, no, didn't form part of the original instruction or questions that were posed to me.
There's nothing about it in your original report
Yeah.
from 2018, but I just wanted to ask if they'd asked you maybe at consultation or by email or anything along those
I
lines.
don't remember anything regarding the actual handling of the incident. It was more around the post-incident management.
So the first time that you were asked to consider that or look at the whole circumstances, was that when the inquiry were in touch with you?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And if we look at paragraph 20 of your inquiry statement, I think towards the bottom of that paragraph, you say the initial assessment of risk across the board to Mr. Bio, the officers and the public has to be high by the inspector. Now we've heard a lot of evidence where officers have said they thought it was a high risk incident. Is it fair to say you agree with that
I
assessment?
would, yes.
Yeah. And we've heard considerable evidence where officers have talked about risks to the subject, the police, and potentially to the public.
Yes, correct.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would say it was high across the board for all parties concerned.
Thank you. And is that primarily because of the allegations in relation to a knife?
Yes, certainly in relation to the public and the officers, but then obviously, as I commented, in relation to Mr. Bayou, that the relevant level of force that may be required to meet that risk would likely to be quite high.
Yeah. Thank you. And in relation to, if you look please at paragraphs, it might be easier on your hard copy, 10, 11 and 12. I'm going to ask you some questions about these paragraphs. So if we start with 10, you were asked about command and control of the incident, including the role of the area control room. And in terms of the initial reports, there were nine emergency calls, 999 calls, 101 calls, from 5 people. One gentleman, we've heard his name, Harry Kohlberg, phoned twice. So you're aware of all of that?
Yes, I was from the original investigation, yeah.
Right. And the reports were generally of a well-built or muscular man in the street carrying a knife. And you say, I understand one individual reported the subject took a flying kick at his car.
I believe so, yes.
Now, I wanted to just check, that's not in the storm records that went into ACR. It's not in the transcripts of the telephone calls made by members of the public. So was that information maybe from some evidence that you heard?
It probably was, if I would have used that particular terminology, because I've lifted it out of some of the evidence that was provided to me.
Well, that's fine. I just wanted to make it clear to you that in terms of the calls that were coming in from the public and the records, the storm records, it wasn't noted on any of those.
Okay, thank you.
And then you said, I think with that information and intelligence available, the requirement for specially trained and equipped staff was a necessity, certainly to consider. And you mentioned that Maxwell requested the ARV and the dog unit.
I believe if you look at the timeline, he was the first one to mention ARV. It may well have been being considered by Inspector Stewart, but the first comment of consideration of ARVs and dog unit appears to be coming from the sergeant who's in charge on the ground.
Yes, in fact, if we look at the spreadsheet in front of you, and you look at page 2, you'll see that Acting Police Sergeant Maxwell at 7:17 and 23
Correct, yeah.
makes a request for all units to attend an ARV and a dog.
That's correct. And I don't think it's until about 7:19 that we have a response from the control room confirming that ARVs are being considered and a dog unit has been assigned.
And you'll see at 7:19:12 Maxwell asks for an update, and then at 7:19:17 the controller we've heard from says, I believe a dog unit is en route. And controller 2, be aware, organising an ARV as well. And we've heard that behind the scenes in the ARV, other members of staff were contacting the dog unit and assessing the situation with the ARV.
Yes.
So you're quite right. The call from Maxwell at 7:17:23 is the first request on the airwaves transmission for specialist resources. And I just want to ask you about that point. Can we begin by looking at the storm record first, so that I can explain something to you? PS 00231. So this is the storm records. There's PS 00231, which starts at 7:14 and 16 seconds on the 3rd of May 2015. This was created at 7:14:17 in response to the first call. So the call came in from Harry Kohlberg at 7:10, and this record was created by a call taker and marked up as 7:14. And then we hear Sergeant Maxwell's airwaves transmission at 7:17. And I'd like to ask you, at what point, knowing what you do about the calls that have come in and the information that was available to the police at that time, at what point would you think a reasonable controller in the ACR would start considering specialist resources?
I think the consideration for specialist resources would have been immediate once the number of calls and the actual information that was being received arrived in front of them. The other thing to consider is the travelling time, knowing the resources that are available to you as the controller, what the possible travelling time would be to that particular incident in that area. And I've commented on when I was asked, in my opinion, if I was the supervisor making that decision at the time, I would have ruled the ARV immediately based on the information and the intelligence that I had, especially knowing that they were 20 to 25 minutes travelling time away from the incident.
So on the basis of the information that's in the storm log, I've shown you this one, which is 7:14, and it says African-looking male was chasing complainer's car and he thinks he may be carrying a knife. And then if we look at 232, we see another storm log that was created at 7:15 and 42 seconds. And on page 2 of this, we see the first entry here. These eventually were combined, if I can see. The first entry here is male in possession of a large knife, a black male wearing white t-shirt, no jacket, walking along the street with a large knife in right hand, about 9-inch blade, walking in the direction of the hospital. And that's at 7:15. So the first one's 7:14, the second one's 7:15, but eventually they are joined together. And I can tell you we've heard evidence about this one that was on the screen now, that this was immediately graded a grade 1 call. Now you've already mentioned to us this morning about a grade 1 call.
Yeah.
You'll understand in Scotland that's immediate threat to life. And we've heard that for grade 1 calls, they come up with a flashing red thing on the screen.
Yeah.
And we've heard that a filter can be applied by the inspector or a sergeant, which only filters the the grade 1 and grade 2 calls.
Yes.
And so the controller, the sergeant and the inspector have this on their computer screen and they're listening to the transmissions. And so the calls come in 7:14, 7:15. I think we've heard evidence the controller very quickly thought they were the same incident. And then you can see from your spreadsheet that is 7:16 on page 2. You'll see that controller 1 is 7:16:32, sends a call out to what was response team 4 and said, I need you to divert to Henry Road, a disturbance ongoing, male armed with a knife, African looking male, chasing someone, maybe carrying a knife, described as big, with muscles about 6 foot tall, wearing a white t-shirt and dark coloured jeans. There's another job coming in about it, stand by.
Yes.
And so at that stage, you would expect the controller to be considering specialist resources.
I think with, as I said, with PS 231 and 232, by the time we get to 7:16, so we're 2 minutes in, we've got more calls coming in, then yes, I personally would have, I think there's sufficient intelligence there, sufficient information that, you know, a number of members of the public are so concerned to ring in. We've got eyewitness account of the individual being in possession of a knife. Grade 1 call, I would have ruled or authorised ARV deployment at that point.
So in paragraph 10 in your inquiry statement, you've talked about with the information and intelligence available, the requirement for specially trained and equipped staff was a necessity, certainly to consider. You're actually saying that in those circumstances, you think it's more than consideration that should be given. You would have...
I would have considered it and I would have deployed. I would have authorised and deployed at that point.
Now, we've heard that if we think about a hypothetical reasonable officer, there may be more than one option available. And you personally may choose one and someone else may choose the other, and they could both be equally reasonable options. And so I'd like to ask you questions on the basis of what the range of reasonable options might be to an officer who is acting in accordance with his legal requirements, his acting in accordance with the standard operating procedures, guidance, his ethical obligations.
Yes.
Mr. Graham, just before you go into that, I'm going to take a very short break.
Yes.
Yes, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. The break's given me an opportunity to look at something, Mr. Graves. I understand that in fact you were sent training materials in your instruction from Crown Office in 2018.
I've certainly listed them in my original report from 2018, but I haven't detailed them, but I do have access to the detailed list, which I can check and tell you exactly what documents were provided.
I don't think you were given the PowerPoint. You
I
can
s-
perhaps confirm that, but I think you may have been given at least a manual.
I think I was giving a very heavily redacted manual, which had basically very little information in it.
All right, thank you. And I think in addition you were given a use of force standard operating procedure.
Yes, which I believe was identical to the original one that I was given.
Thank you. So just to go back, we were talking about how there could be a range of options open to a reasonable officer. Two officers could both act in accordance with the legislation and their SOPs and ethical obligations, but maybe take different courses of action.
That's correct, yes.
And so when we're going through some aspects where you've expressed a view, I would ask maybe if we can talk about the possible ranges of options that would be open.
Yes, definitely.
And we're looking at this aspect in relation to the storm cards information
Yep.
and the airwaves transmission. This is information that's available to the controller in
Yes.
the ACR at the same time. And so the first call card in the storm log is 714. The controller, as we've looked at 716, diverts a unit to Henry Road
Yes.
in relation to response to these messages. So we have the calls 714, 715, and then the controller going onto the airwaves at 716 and sending a unit to the area.
Yes.
And we've also looked at Maxwell's request for specialist resources, ARV and dog, and requesting for all units at 716.
Yes.
So we see 714, 715, 716, 717. And you've indicated that a controller, aware of all these logs and transmissions, would be considering specialist resources.
Certainly by the time we get to 716, probably not with the original 714 because there's insufficient, in my opinion, there's insufficient information on there to confirm that a knife or an edge weapon is involved. The 715 indicates that there is, and then from memory, I believe the 716 call, the additional calls that come in again, confirm that the individual was in possession of a knife.
So is it if we look at 714, there was mention of a knife.
Yeah.
There's more detail in the 715 storm log.
Yes.
But you think from the 715 storm log, that would be, plus the additional calls coming in, you think that would be the moment where the controller would be considering?
Yes. Yes, definitely. So I would say by sort of 716, we've got there 717 additional calls. So yes, I would say around about that 16, 17 benchmark would be when I would be considering the...
And that would be happening even before Sergeant Maxwell's request for an ARV or a dog?
If I was that controller, then yes, I would already be considering that prior to Sergeant Maxwell requesting one anyway.
But for a reasonable controller, would it be reasonable for that person to start thinking about specialist resources after Maxwell's call?
I would have hoped, as I said, I would have thought that that consideration would already be in place prior to that. It's unusual where somebody on the ground has to make that request without it have already been either considered or instigated by the control staff.
And you know that in Scotland, and we agreed earlier that to deploy an ARV in Scotland, that has to be something within the authority of the inspector.
That's correct.
But the lower ranks do not have that authority.
Yes.
And so when you said the reasonable controller would consider these things, What would that consideration look like?
You're looking at the risk factors, taking into consideration the number of calls, the quality of the information that's being contained in those messages. You may well speak to the call handler who has received the call to establish how realistic the information may be from the informant. How did they sound? But I think you just with the sheer number. I mean, it's a Sunday morning. It's usually very quiet on that time on a Sunday morning. When you start getting 6 and 7 calls to one location, to one incident, and to one individual, you sit up quite quickly and start taking notice of it.
Thank you. And we've heard that on page 2, as you'll see, by 7:19, the controller is saying, I believe a dog unit is en route. And we've heard that behind the scenes, a member of the staff in the ACR has been in contact with a dog unit, and they're attending from Edinburgh.
Yes, I would have expected that to be happening. Yeah.
And we can see from if we go back to storm log PS 232, we've heard today that at 7:21 there is SD18, which related to specialist dogs units. They're coming from Edinburgh. But prior to that, at 7:18, 18 seconds, SD10 was supposed to be attending.
Yes.
But I think we heard this morning from the dog handler that the initial dog handler was travelling a further distance, and then he was brought in to come from Edinburgh.
Yes.
So by the time Maxwell seeks an update at 7:19, 2 dog handlers have been contacted, and one is coming. Sorry, that's not correct. 1 dog handler has been contacted and is attending, and then shortly after at 7:21, a second closer dog handler has been contacted.
Yes.
And in relation to the ARV element, 7:19:23 on page 2, we see Con 2, Controller 2, saying, be aware organising an ARV as well. Now, we've not heard from that particular witness, but we understand that the inspector wasn't actually in the overview room until 7:18 approximately. And he did not authorise the deployment of an ARV. And I'm interested in your view about this particular evidence. So his name's Inspector Stewart. We heard from him yesterday.
Yes.
And he took the view that he would not deploy the ARV, although contact had been made with them. They were in Edinburgh. But until he received feedback as to what was happening on the ground, that it was not appropriate for him to deploy the ARV. If you take those facts as circumstances, would you say that that was within the range of a reasonable approach for?
It is an approach that could be used. My caveat with that is the time delay in getting that type of resource to the scene. If you know the ARV is 20-25 minutes away, and as I said, this is my opinion based on similar situations where I've had to wait for backup, I would have had that authorization in place and had that unit travelling to the scene as a safety precaution for the officers and the members of the public that may be at risk should they come across the subject.
In terms of the speed at which you would expect the ACR department to have that deployment in place, We know in Scotland it has to be the inspector
Yes.
who has the authority. Do you have any views about how quickly that should have been deployed?
If he wasn't in the room at 7:18, I would expect him to be taking a couple of minutes to review the various messages, review the intelligence and the information that's come in before making that decision. The decision that was made, I think, was to some degree influenced by the fact that officers had already been deployed and were reasonably close to the scene. So taking the decision not to authorise, I can understand it. I personally don't agree with it, but that, as you said, that's my opinion based on my years of experience in doing that role. I can understand that, and as I said, awaiting, and he does actually, request an update from the attending officers, which appears to take place literally as the officers come into contact with Mr. Bayo. So it's an understandable decision, but I still stick with my opinion that I would have had that unit running, but in reality it wouldn't have made any difference because they would never have reached the scene before the incident developed.
So ultimately we're talking about small periods of time, and it wouldn't have actually made any difference even if that decision had been made earlier.
No. In hindsight, with the development of the situation being so rapid, that decision was moot really in relation to the ARVs attending or not attending.
What importance would you place on officers on the ground knowing that an ARV had been deployed?
I think the deployment is, it's something that they would probably expect. As I said, Sergeant Maxwell certainly expected it and requested it. I think officers faced with that type of call, or that number of calls, would expect an armed response to be assigned, and it would give them some sort of support in relation to what might happen if they come across an individual armed with a knife.
And where a request has been made from a sergeant on the ground, what importance do you think a reasonable controller would give to that specific request from the officer on the ground?
I think you have to give some credence to that. It may well be that the local sergeant is in possession of more information or more intelligence that may sway that decision, that the controller may not be in possession of. But I think you have to take it. But overall, the decision lies with the inspector to authorise that deployment. The sergeant can ask as many times as they like, but it's down to the inspector, based on the information that's in front of them, to make that decision.
Would it be reasonable for a controller to have regard to a sergeant who may know his team and the particular experience and skills and makeup of the team that has working under him?
It could certainly be an impacting factor, yes.
And that's not necessarily something that a controller would have any information about?
Probably not. As again, I commented elsewhere in my interview that with regional, area control rooms, that lack of local knowledge is one of the downturns of having that type of system in place, because you lose that local information, that local intelligence, which can only come from the officers on the ground.
We've also heard that local information is not necessarily always accurate or available to controllers in the ACR.
That's correct, yes.
So personally, they may not have experience of particular areas. And also we've heard that the mapping system on their computers may not always be accurate?
Yes, I can give examples when I've been in the central control at Scotland Yard, whereby, you know, a big call would come in, and it may be that somebody on another desk sees it or hears it and says, "Oh, that's my old ground. I know that." It's actually passed to them to sort of help control it because they've got that local knowledge. It's not always the case in a lot of control rooms that I've been in or sat and watched.
So where the controller also has some local knowledge, can that be of assistance
It can be, yes, definitely.
in carrying out this risk assessment?
Yes, definitely.
Can I just ask you to reflect for a moment on paragraphs 23 to 25? I think we've covered most of this. You've been asked to consider the grade 1 call and the immediate response to that, and the questions that a controller would be asking themselves about deployment of resources. And in paragraph 24, you mention the speed at which this developed obviously negates an awful lot of the decision making, because the decision to some degree was taken out of the inspector's hands because it was dealt with very quickly on the ground. The officers had obviously made the decision, whether they came across it by accident or saw him and approached as they did, getting quite close. The response officers having made that decision to approach the male and assess the male, I think from there it developed so quickly. There's little or no additional information going back to the control room until such time as Nicole Short is assaulted.
That's correct, yes.
Can we talk about that? We've heard that the inspector was seeking feedback,
Yes,
information, and his expectation was that officers who arrived at the scene would provide that feedback via their radios.
yes.
And you've commented there that there's little or no additional information being fed back to the ACR. Can you
Yes,
explain the importance of that information?
I think with Inspector Stewart having made the decision that he was going to depend upon an update from the scene before he made the decision to deploy ARVs, it was very relevant and very important for him to get that information as soon as possible. His transmission in relation to requesting that information virtually crosses with the first officers arriving on scene and engaging with the subject. So I think it's, that from that time forward, he doesn't really get that information that he requires to make that tactical decision in relation to the ARVs.
We see on the transcript that Inspector Stewart came on to the airwaves at 7:20:13, and we've called this variously a stay safe message. Inspector Stewart, area control room to the set, attending. I'm monitoring this obviously from an ARV perspective. If you get sightings of the male, you need to make an initial assessment yourself and feedback through straight away, and I'll listen out on the channel. And we've heard that there was an expectation from the inspector that the officers on the ground would carry out an initial risk assessment, a dynamic risk assessment, and then feedback, go on their radios and give information to ACR.
That would be the standard practice, yes.
And we've heard that he expected that before he made any decisions about an armed response vehicle.
Yes, I mean, having made his decision along those lines, yes, he would have to wait for that type of information to come in before he made a further judgment.
Would you be able to help us with what type of information would an officer on the ground be expected to feed back?
I think the first bit of information is actual contact with the subject. So the fact that you've found the person that you're looking for, that again would then increase the risk, because now we're not just talking about officers driving around looking for somebody, we're talking about officers actually engaging and actually coming across the individual who they believe they're looking for. So that would have been the first bit of information I would have been waiting for, some sort of contact message, some sort of we've got him, you know, at the bus stop or something like that. Just something to indicate that the subject has been located.
And does located mean actually seen visibly?
Yes, visibly
in the area?
seen. Not so much contact, because then the decision by the officers then has to be whether they're going to observe, whether they're going to approach, whether they're going to engage.
So it could be that there's some sort of contact with ACR via the radio from the vehicle
Yes,
as they approach the area.
yes.
And that's the sort of thing you would expect an officer to provide.
I would have hoped for that. What I would say is in those sorts of situations, bearing in mind the level of risk the officers perceived, that is probably one of the first things that goes out the window, because they become focused on the incident rather than the impact on others and the bigger picture. They'll become very focused on what's in front of them.
So how common is it for officers who are sent to an incident not to provide that type of feedback to ACR?
It's very common, unfortunately. What you tend to find is that the original officers you won't hear from because they're dealing with the situation. What you then hope for is the second unit or third unit to arrive, because they've got that slight bit of distance, will give that information to the control room based on, we've just arrived on scene, officers are engaging, officers are talking, whatever, we're at such and such a location.
So officers who maybe aren't first on the scene but who arrive shortly after, there's not an end point to feedback. They can continue to provide that feedback.
Yes, you would hope that somebody down the line, you know, it might be the case that if officers are engaged in a struggle, the next officers arriving will go to that as the primary concern, and then the third unit arriving will be the ones that give the update because the restraint has taken place, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But at some point you'd expect that feedback.
When it's been requested, but even without it being requested, it's just common practice and best practice to get that information out to other units arriving.
We did hear from Inspector Stewart that he said this is really effectively a reminder to staff who are trained to provide the feedback.
Yes, it's
You'd
correct.
agree with that?
Yes, I would.
And we've talked about officers maybe observing, I think was the word that you used, as they approach the area and can provide feedback then, or when they leave their vehicles they can provide feedback.
Yes, they can provide it over their personal radios.
And is that something that's very simple to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's press a button and talk. With this particular incident, we also have 2 activations of emergency buttons on the radios. I'm sure you've heard evidence, but that basically opens up the channel to that particular radio and gives that radio priority over other signals. So even then, just pressing that button, you can then shout instructions, you can shout locations. It gives you that opportunity to be basically hands-free, but still communicating with the control room.
So they don't need to touch anything on the
No,
radio at all?
once that's activated, it opens the channel and opens it for between 10 and 15 seconds, depending on the radio set.
Looking at the spreadsheet again, you've mentioned the events after the message from Inspector Stewart. So that's at 7:20 and 13 seconds. We heard some evidence yesterday that effectively, although there was no feedback in terms of a conversation or verbal comments from officers, that at 7:20, 42 seconds, you'll see that at the bottom of page 3,
Yeah.
there was an emergency status turned on. That was PC Alan Payton. And by that was acknowledged by Inspector Kay at 7:20 and 56 seconds. And then we see 7:21:02, this is on to page 4,
Yeah.
officer injured, PC short, male. And so, although there's no verbal or communication of feedback, we've heard that turning on an emergency button and then officer injured being transmitted, that is in itself feedback of
Yes.
some description. And at that point, can you explain for an inspector who is in the ACR with authority to deploy an ARV, would it be reasonable at that stage to say it's too late? Things have moved on by then.
I wouldn't use the terminology too late. What you've got to consider is if this was the incident that they thought it might be, you know, the ARV may still be required, because if this individual then escapes the custody of the officers and officers have been injured, you're now doing a search for an armed suspect. So the ARV would be required for that. Around it's too late, I think by the time you get the comment male restrained or male secure, then you're realising that at that point, then the ARV is irrelevant, the ARV is not required. But I think at that point where you're stipulating in relation to the emergency button and the officer assaulted, at that point you don't know the degree of the injury, whether the knife has been used or seen, and whether the ARV is still required.
So at that point, moment in time, is still a matter for consideration?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and as I say, the mere pushing of the emergency button or the activation of the emergency button indicates that that particular officer that's pressed it now requires, in terminology, urgent assistance from other officers.
And then the second emergency status button is 7:21.
Yes.
So 19 seconds after officers injured is transmitted.
Yeah.
And male secure on the ground is also 7:21. This is at top of page 5.
Yes.
7:21:38. But that's the point, I think, at which you say it would be reasonable to no longer consider an ARV appropriate.
Yeah, I would still probably want an update just to make sure that everything was okay, and the ARV wasn't required. But at that point, in my considerations, that's when I would be thinking it's too late to deploy or consider deployment of an ARV.
So a reasonable officer in the ACR would not necessarily consider it appropriate at that stage?
Not at that late stage, no.
I'd like to ask you about the situation. I took you a moment to go to your comments about the speed at which things developed. And what impact can that have on officers who are attempting to do risk assessments, attempting to prepare plans?
The speed at which an incident develops greatly impacts on any human being's ability to rationally process information that's coming in. We become more responsive and more reactive than considering the actual actions that we're doing. This is all part and parcel of the training that officers receive around the effects of stress on the body, and a heightened heart rate, heightened breathing, etc., and how that can impact on not just physical reactions but also psychological in your thought processes in relation to that sort of incident. So we become more reactive, and the way I try to explain it sometimes is you're driving your car down the motorway and the car in front brakes heavily. You still have that ability to react to that stimulus. The stimulus is the car slowing down. It takes your brain approximately 0.3 of a second to process that information and to instigate a physical action to deal with that problem, i.e. slam your brakes on. And if, for those of us that remember the highway code, if you think about the back page of a highway code, you have the speed, stopping distances for the vehicle. The one thing that doesn't change is the thinking distance, because that's the speed at which our normal cognitive brains in a live situation can process that information, that visual cue. Unfortunately, as the adrenaline is released into the body, as the heart rate rises, that time thinking time basically expands and we need longer to process information. Therefore, it's more difficult for officers to process rapid changes and come up with accurate tactical responses to those. And it becomes more reactive and instinctive than it does actually a thought process, for want of a better terminology.
I'd like to ask you about, we touched earlier on risk assessments and considering risk to the officers, the subject and members of the public if they're in the vicinity. And I'd like to have your views on what control measures could be in place to protect officers and the public from a subject who is alleged to have a knife.
The simple control measures for the officers are not to engage or not to become close enough to the individual for them to become at risk. So with a knife, obviously, you have to be in close proximity for that individual to injure you. So the simplest control measure is to keep a distance from that individual, a substantial distance if possible. Engage in conversation if necessary, if you deem that is appropriate, or observe that individual from a distance. The problem then you have, that keeps the officers safe, but what it then does or can do is if a member of the public then comes into close proximity with the individual who is allegedly armed, that member of the public now becomes at risk. And obviously, as officers, we have a duty to respond and a duty to keep the public safe. Therefore, that control measure is not always suitable or appropriate to the situation that you find yourself. In relation to, again, Mr. Bayou, you think that if officers don't approach and don't engage, what could happen? What could he do? Where could he go? Etc. So there's that balancing act between the risk to those three areas, but the predominant overview is that the police are responsible for the safety of the public. Therefore, they may have to act and may have to put themselves in a position of risk to mitigate that risk to the public.
If we've heard evidence that there were no public in the vicinity, although it was a residential area, early hours of Sunday, there were people in cars but not out on the street. So where there are no public visible in the vicinity, does that have an impact? Does it permit more time to be spent?
I think it certainly could do, yes. Options such as putting a cordon in or putting a block in on the road to stop any vehicles coming down would be an option.
How easy would that be to create?
Thinking of the location that the incident took place, it would have been quite easy to block the roundabout on one side. Obviously, I'm not aware of what was down the other side of the road, but again, if that thought process had gone through somebody's mind, they may have directed a unit to the other side of the street, again, to stop anybody trying to get to where the subject was. So they could have stood back and seen what happened. The officers made the decision to engage.
How easy is it to create a cordon?
Very difficult in an open area. You've got to consider...
what do you mean by an open area?
Well, various escape routes. There was various footpaths. There was an open grass area. There was trees. So it's very difficult, virtually impossible, to put what they call a floating containment in place for somebody who is wandering around the streets. Far more easy if you've got them contained in a building or down an alleyway or something like that. It's easier to control. But it's very difficult, and you would literally be responding to whatever direction the subjects walked in. So if they walk one direction, you walk with them. They walk back towards you, you walk away from them. So it's a nigh impossible task to accomplish in an open space area.
If there are no members of the public in the area, But obviously in that area that may change. Does that permit the officers a longer period of time, more opportunity to consider their tactics?
I think it probably would if that was their initial assessment of the tactical option to use should they find the individual. What you're remembering is that the national decision model is being run through in the officers' heads on an ongoing basis. So as the different calls come in, as the different bits of information come in, they're constantly reviewing their options and their processes as to how they're going to deal with this individual should they come across them. And officers will make a decision based on that assessment. So in this instance, the decision was made to engage, if they found him, was to engage. The fact that there were no members of the public around, if the decision had been different, if they'd made the decision is we're going to try and locate but not contact or not engage with the individual, we're going to just try and locate them, then yes, the fact that there was no members of the public there would have changed or altered the assessment of risk to the public based on that bit of information. But as you said, that could have changed very quickly by somebody coming out their door, a car passing, something like that.
I'd like to put some different scenarios to you and ask for your views. The first would involve non-engagement by the officers, and by that I mean that they would move to a rendezvous point, so a remote area. For example, in this location, such as Gallagher's pub car park. And the officers could park in the car park, wait there, same position, same location, keep their eyes on the subject. If he walked off, they could try to contain him. They would have to be fluid. There would be a potential risk to members of the public if they appeared. It would have to be closely monitored, but they could take a point of view from Gallagher's car park and see the roundabout and the streets in that area. And while they were there waiting, feedback to ACR.
Certainly, if it had been declared as a firearms incident or the ARVs had been deployed, then that would be what I would have expected to happen. Officers would have been sent to a forward rendezvous point, ready for deployment or ready to support armed vehicle when they arrived. Somebody had to have view of the subject. The safest place to do that, to be honest, is inside the vehicle. Because short of the person then smashing their way into the vehicle, you're inside the car, you lock the car doors, they can't really do you a lot of damage with a knife. So somebody would have probably just pulled up on the road and observed the individual. So yes, it was an option. I don't think it was a requirement because of the decision to deploy to the scene. That decision had already been made. So I think sensible deployment of the units arriving as how they got there and where they went to was probably more beneficial than everybody turning up to one place. But that again would have been better if that initial contact information had been given by the first officers spotting the subject. And then basically saying we've got sight of him in such and such an area next to the bus stop, etc.
Let's just go over that maybe in a little more detail. So in terms of a rendezvous point, if we can call that this scenario, rendezvous point, would that instruction have come from the ACR?
Certainly if they'd declared or signed ARVs or declared it as a firearms incident, I would have expected that decision and that instruction to come from the control room inspector. It's also a decision that could have been made by the sergeant. He could have made that
Right.
decision on the ground, taking into the same consideration information that the inspector was taking into consideration. It's unusual to have a rendezvous point unless you've got somebody there to then assign or control that rendezvous point and then assign units from there.
If you have officers arriving on a scene at different times, quite quickly, but at different times, does that make it harder to organise a rendezvous point?
Yes, very much so.
So is that decision to direct officers to a rendezvous point made easier by making that decision in advance of them actually arriving at the
It
scene?
is. One of the other considering points is also is how many units have you actually got? Because if you've only got 4 units, which is not unusual on a early Sunday morning, if your 4 units is all you've got and you think it's going to take 4 units to deal with that particular incident, the 4 units go to the scene to deal with that particular incident, you haven't got the luxury of then deploying to a rendezvous point unless you've got the resources to actually operate that type of system.
What resources do you need to operate a rendezvous point?
You're certainly going to need a marshalling officer to sort of bring them in and hold them. Somebody there to make the decisions around deployment or basically deploying them from that scene. And then obviously the resources that you actually need to deploy. You can run a rendezvous point with 2 or 3 units, but if your total shift is 4 units and you send 3 to the rendezvous point, you've only got the 1 unit that's actually dealing with the incident.
If all units have been called to a rendezvous point, does that permit that mechanism to be
Yes.
implemented?
Certainly, as I said, from a firearms point of view, that would be the standard practice. All units would go to a rendezvous point, await the arrival of the armed unit. The armed unit would then go to the call or go to the individual, deal with it, and then they would probably have an unarmed unit in support of them for possibly arrest and detention purposes or bringing that person out of the location.
So having all the officers arrive at a rendezvous point allows more coordination about how they're going to handle the incident?
Yes, it gives them time to consider the approaches, the requirements. I talked about blocking roads and things like that. It gives you a little bit more time to think of that plan, which we would hopefully be coming down from the inspector at the control room, and then the sergeant on scene acting as the bronze and putting those tactical decisions into practice.
And you've talked about if there was a firearms incident declared, that's the type of arrangement that you would expect to be in place, a rendezvous point.
Yes.
What if there's no firearms incident declared?
Certainly,
Is it still an option?
It's still an option. Yes, it is still an option. But as I said, that's sort of mitigated by the number of units that you've got and the number of units that are likely to be needed to deal with the particular incident. As I say, I think 4 or 5 units on the day turned up.
We've got a large number of cars.
And then there's a lot more turning up afterwards. So you might dictate that 3 or 4 go to the scene, and then make the decision that any remainder hold at an RVP pending contact with the individual, pending more information.
So just to be clear about when that type of decision can be made in relation to a rendezvous point, you can have it before any officer arrives at the scene?
Yes.
Or once officers have arrived at the scene?
Yes.
Or once a number of units have arrived at the scene?
Yeah, could be. That decision has to be made as to how many units are going to be required to deal with the initial threat or the initial risk. And then you regularly see it where you've got sort of 10 or 15 vehicles parked down the road, and you don't need 10 or 50, they're just blocking the road. So you may as well say, please gather at the car park, or please go to this location and stand by. So.
Right. And if officers are in a rendezvous point, parked and located there, you said you would expect a marshal. Is that someone in
It's somebody
charge?
basically just bringing them in, indicating who you've got, so that when the bronze arrived, whether it be the sergeant or whatever, he can say, right, you've got 5 units here. These are the units you've got. Where do you want them? What do you want them to do? And then the sergeant can make that decision, and the marshalling officer would send them out to do whatever the particular job is that needs doing.
And you said earlier that it's possible for officers to take that decision, not simply an inspector in the ACR.
Yes, could be.
If it's officers, individual officers who take that decision, would they have to nominate someone as a marshal?
If they'd probably be the first unit on scene to the rendezvous point, really, that's what normally would happen. They'd turn up, and somebody would then start, marshalling and actually, coordinating what's happening.
Could we look at paragraph 77 of your inquiry statement, please? And we'll see the start of this on the screen. I'm asked about the evidence of PC Peyton, in which he addresses the possibility of an alternative course of action.
Yes.
Namely parking in Gallagher's pub car park and waiting for the arrival of an ARV, and just observing and monitoring Mr. Bio and providing feedback to the ACR, and whether this would be an appropriate course of action. Yes, I think it was certainly a course of action that, if they considered it, was appropriate. The issue being, as I said earlier, the fact that there is still a danger to members of the public. If we can move down the screen. So they may have decided that's what they wanted to do. However, if they had either the control room or the supervisor, could have directed that they search the area for the subject.
That's correct, yeah.
And just to look at that paragraph, are you envisaging in this situation that it would have been the officers who took the decision to gather in the car park?
Based on that evidence from PC Peyton, yeah, they could have made that decision initially to try and locate Mr. Bio. Once they'd located him, stand back, observe, and coordinate, with the control room. So yes, it was a viable option. Yes, it was a decision that could have been made, but it wasn't made. Their decision was to, engage.
So thinking about options that are open to reasonable officers, then that is an option that would have been open to reasonable officers.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. And are you envisaging in this paragraph that when they're in the car park, there would be feedback with the ACR, the other officers who are on their radios?
If that decision had been made and that tactical choice had been their go-to, then yes, I would have expected them to basically immediately, on locating Mr. Bio, stating that they've found him, the location and what he's doing, and most importantly, is he in a possession of a knife or can they see the knife?
Right. And in circumstances where, for example, officers have decided to gather in a rendezvous point, and that is fed back to the control room, to the controller, to the sergeant inspector, to what extent would that set of circumstances and that feedback be inputted by those officers in ACR into their assessment of risk?
I think it would indicate to the control room inspector that the officers on the ground have major concerns around going to and engaging with a subject believed armed with a knife. And it would show them that their tactical choice or their decision making and their risk assessment on the ground has indicated that the risk is too great for them to actually approach the individual, and that they want to handle it in a slightly different way.
So that in itself would be indicative of maybe an elevated perception of risk?
Yes.
And that would equally go into their own risk assessment in terms of the NDM?
Yes, I mean, each individual officer would be assessing the risk to them personally, and as we've said, they could all be coming up with slightly different decisions and slightly different versions of the level of risk that they're facing in that circumstance.
Thank you. And then I'd like to move on to another scenario and ask you about this. This again would be a non-engagement with the officers on the ground, with the subject. But in this case, they wouldn't move to a remote rendezvous point, but perhaps a park nearby in the street, at the end of the street or in the vicinity. So non-engagement, observe, wait, and feedback. So you can imagine parked, remaining within the vehicle, but observing, waiting, and feeding back to ACR. Stop the car, perhaps a short distance away, and say to themselves, I can see him, this is what's happening to him. So observing what the subject looks like, what he's doing, what's happening at that moment in time, and the location. And then creating some space and distance there. So not bringing themselves out of the vehicle into potential harm's way.
Yes, certainly a viable tactical option and quite a sound one, really. Even better would have been if there was an unmarked vehicle as part of the team. You know, maybe driving past, observing from a distance, and calling an unmarked vehicle in to take over that observation. So
initial officers at the scene, if they saw the subject, they could park a short distance away and communicate equally with other officers who were all units due to attend, other officers who may be in a different type of vehicle.
Yes, it's certainly an option, yes. But that's got to be balanced against, as I say, their perception of risk to the public. And as I say, at that point, there isn't anybody there.
Yeah.
But that could change very quickly, and that could instantly change what they've got to do. But they need to be in a position to react to that, but without escalating the situation.
So maybe being a little closer physically in terms of where the vehicle's parked would allow a quicker reaction, perhaps?
Yes.
And in terms of the observation, what would you expect officers in this situation to be feeding back to ACR?
As I said, location, demeanour, what they're doing, behaviour, and whether they're in possession of the weapon, the alleged weapon.
And what would be the benefits of waiting at a close distance to the subject?
There's a number of benefits to it. One could be waiting for sufficient officers to more safely deal with that individual. Depending on the length of time, waiting for the armed support, if it had been deployed, the armed support to arrive and make that initial engagement. But it all just gives you thinking time, gives you more time to consider the options and the what-ifs based on, you know, the decisions.
Or you could be waiting for other specialist resources, a dog unit or ERV. And that thinking time, what's the benefit of that thinking time?
As I said, I think the fact that you can mull over the decisions that you've made, you can think about, you know, is that really the best choice of option, but also be prepared then from that point that if it escalates and escalates quickly, how and what you're going to do in that set of circumstances.
And would one of the benefits also be that other units can join, so you have more support from other officers?
As I said, if you're the first, you're the first unit there, I might look at a situation and say, well, I'm going to need at least 3 units here. So I want 6 officers on scene before I consider placing myself in a position of risk. You know, maybe 8, maybe 10, maybe 12. But that's a decision that officer would make. So it would be that position, that thought process of, yes, I'm happy to deal with this as we are, or no, I want X, X, and X in place before we go and deal with this.
And so that type of option would be one that would be open to a reasonable officer?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. And then I should perhaps say that in that scenario, what impact would that decision by the initial officers have on ACR? So if ACR are getting feedback and officers are sitting in the van, how would that impact on the risk assessment that the control room staff are performing?
Well, certainly the initial bit of additional intelligence or additional information is the fact that the subject has now been found and located. Then you're looking for, as I said, what are they doing? are they presenting a risk? Are they in possession of a weapon? But we must remember that just the fact that we can't see the weapon doesn't mean that they're not in possession of one. But the major fact here is that we've actually located the individual. You know, the number of calls that officers go to and they search the area for 20 minutes or 15 minutes looking for the person, and they're never ever found. So if you know, that sort of situation as against, well, actually we've arrived, they're there, they fit the description of the individual allegedly concerned in this call, they're allegedly in possession of a knife, that raises that level of risk straight away.
And does that period of time of observation, for a reasonable officer, would that also permit them time to look at the demeanour of the subject and see how they appeared as well?
Certainly from a distance, yes. I mean, you're not going to get that much information from just the observations. You get far more from interaction with the individual. But yes, it would certainly give you an opportunity to observe, you know, look at whether they're staggering, whether they're acting bizarrely or unusually, you know, wandering in and out of the streets. So just what do they look like? What are they presenting to you?
And if that person was if an officer was able to see that the person had eyes bulging out of their head, is that the type of thing that you might be able to feed back to ACR?
It would, but what I would suggest is the distance that you'd probably be away from them would be quite difficult to identify that at that sort of distance. You know, you only see that sort of physical evidence when you're in reasonable proximity to an individual. So yeah, it would be difficult from a distance observing from a vehicle.
But if you were able to tell that the person appeared perhaps to be in a mental health crisis or to be intoxicated in some way, again, would that period of observation and waiting time permit that information to be fed back to ACR?
It would allow you to gather more information and certainly then pass that on to the ACR and also to the other units arriving.
We heard evidence yesterday that if ACR are told certain information about a person that indicates they may be having a mental health crisis or be intoxicated, that they would contact ambulance services immediately because it was perhaps a medical emergency.
Yes.
Do you agree that that's the type of thing
if
that
you've got that
ACR
sort of information available to you, it would be standard practice to call for medical assistance, yes.
Yes. I'd like to move on to a third scenario and ask you about this. If we can, this is the first scenario where there would actually be engagement with the officers, de-escalation. So this has been described as an engage and negotiate and de-escalate. So unarmed officers attend a location, they are trying to understand what is going on, which would then allow them to inform the decision making about the process, that they would provide additional updates to ACR and their other officers. It would provide them with various options, such as the opportunity to communicate. It would be key to building rapport, and they would attempt to de-escalate, engage and negotiate. So that type of situation where there is engagement with the subject. So this is envisaged, they're not sitting in a vehicle, any position, they're actually approaching the subject. And in relation to that type of scenario, again, is that the sort of option that's open to reasonable officers who are approaching a subject?
It's certainly another option for officers to consider. Even within that, there's ways of still keeping yourself safer, such as things as pulling alongside, you know, opening the window a little bit, talking to the individual through the window, keeping the doors locked, things like that. You know, there's other ways of protecting yourself from the possibility of the knife attack.
We've heard about a process called CUT.
Yes.
Which would permit an officer to engage with someone but to retain that distance.
Yes, it's CUT's majority basically based on reaction time and best practice around incidents involving edge weapons or sharp implements. So as I said before, the primary protection against an edge weapon is the distance you can maintain from the individual. So the further away you are from them, the less opportunity that individual has to injure you. The second one is use cover. So again, that's why I emphasise about using the vehicle, even if it was the case of pulling up and the passenger, if Mr. Byer was on the passenger side not getting out, the driver getting out and engaging over the top of the car. So you've got the car between you and the subject. So you've always got that barrier. But the T is exactly what we've been talking about for the ACR, is transmitting where you are, what they're doing, what's going on, getting that additional information into the other units that are attending so that they know exactly what they're coming into.
So again, the using cover could be keeping the vehicle between you and the subject, or it could be rolling down the window and speaking.
Yes, just keeping some sort of physical barrier between you and the individual. That could be a set of railings, a fence, a vehicle, a bit of street furniture, a bus shelter, giving you some sort of protection from that individual getting direct contact with you.
Yeah. And again, transmit, is that the sort of feedback that you're giving on the radio to ACR and to other colleagues?
Yeah, it's sold as transmit for help. That's basically how it's sold for. If you're dealing with an edge weapon incident, you want help, you want specialist support, you want more officers to come and help you. So yes, but that's the sort of information, as I've said before, we found them, think we've got the subject here, bang, haven't seen a knife yet, however, bang.
And again, does that permit an officer more time, more opportunity to observe and see what's happening?
To some degree, yes, but you're now in the situation whereby that risk can go very, very quickly. It can develop very, very quickly. It doesn't take a lot of time for an individual to draw a weapon and attempt to use it on you. And people can travel over a large distance in a very, very short period of time to get to where you are to cause you that injury with the knife. So we may be thinking sort of 6, 8, 10 feet. That distance can be closed down in a fraction of a second, and you're then at risk to that attack.
Would a reasonable officer then be in a position to observe the subject and have a clearer picture of their demeanour and their body language and how they appeared?
Yes, definitely, yeah.
So again, at that point, this engagement would permit a clearer assessment of whether the person is under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or perhaps suffering a mental health crisis.
Well, even to the extent of, as I said, from a distance, you're not going to get that much feedback from what they are. But the fact that you're trying to engage verbally, and whether you're, depending on the type of response you may get an ill response whereby the person's ignoring you. You then have to factor in, why is this person ignoring me? Is it because of some sort of medical condition, drug or alcohol intoxication, or is it the fact they just don't like us and they don't want to talk to us? So it's assessing that situation because of now the verbal or the lack of verbal response is now added to the mix of what you've been viewing in the non-verbal communication world. Now you're getting some verbal communication to add to it.
So we've heard a number of officers talk about the national decision-making model permits always additional information, and when you get that additional information, whatever it may be, it goes back into the process and the cycle, and you're constantly reviewing and evolving your risk assessment.
Yes, it's an ongoing process. As more information comes in, you go back to the beginning of the model, you basically reassess, add that to the mix, reassess the risk, reassess the threat to yourself, consider what you might now be dealing with, what powers and policies have I got to deal with this, and then what basically tactical options, options have I got to deal with this person in this situation at this time.
Thank you. I wonder if we could perhaps adjourn now before I move on to the fourth and final.
I think for administrative reasons I wanted to stop about 3:45, so it's now 4:45. So we'll resume again on Monday at 10 a.m.